Prior to being listed for heart transplant, did you understand everything there is to know about the current transplant status listing system? Probably not. As a matter of fact, if you're like I am, you really had no idea what that was way back then. But basically what it has to do with is where you're going to be on the list, whether you're very near the top, near the bottom, or somewhere in the middle. It's the transplant status listing that decides how you're allocated when those organs come, your wait times, as well as potentially your survival. So today on the Transplant Helper, we're going to be talking about that system itself, the various categories that are available right now, as well as toward the end of the program, getting into a discussion about the system that's up and coming, some changes that are going to be coming in the near future that may change everything altogether. So you'll want to see all the way to the end. So keep watching and stay tuned. Well, hey folks, I appreciate you once again joining me on the Transplant Helper podcast / YouTube video series. My name is Jim Merle, and yes, today once again we're talking about the Transplant Status Listing System. And again, that has to do with where you are on the list, whether it be very near the top, near the bottom, or somewhere in the middle. Now, as we begin our discussion today, let me start out by telling you right now, as we currently stand in the heart transplant world, and it's different for other organs, but in the heart transplant world, there are basically 4 categories that exist. You can either be listed as a status 1A, a status 1B, a status 2, or as a status 7. And we're going to take those categories and start from the very bottom and come up and describe a little bit about what they mean. And let me say in the onset, every single case is different, so there's really no need in us arguing about where you were listed and why you were listed that way. These are just the categories that are laid out. And by the way, these are not categories that your local doctor made up or anybody else. This comes all the way down from the very top of the National Donor Associations, particularly from the United Network of Organ Sharing, or UNOS as we refer to them. They've decided these allocations. They put out the national criteria to which the doctors can only follow their recommendations. Now, with that said, if you go all the way to the very bottom of the list to begin with, you have to understand that very lowest tier is what's called a status 7. Now, status 7 is really an inactive status. That means that you've been listed for transplant. In the future out there, there's a possibility that you're going to receive a transplant because you need it. However, at the current moment, you're listed as inactive. That is, you're not actively on the list. You're not actively going to get any of those phone calls to come in for transplant. Now, that could be for various reasons. It could be easily for the best reason, which is that you've gotten better. That is, they listed you for transplant. You made some strides or some improvements. Maybe your ejection fraction, your heart function's improved, and so they've decided or deemed that you don't need a transplant at the moment. They're not taking you off the list per se, but they're just putting you inactive or in a holding pattern, and you can wait a little bit longer. Now, there are other reasons for being put at status 7, which could be that you've had some sort of mechanical devices installed, like an LVAD, like a BiVAD, that sort of thing. Sometimes those mechanical devices that they install, which ultimately will allow you to be near the top tiers of the list, but at the current moment while you're healing from those surgeries and trying to make those recoveries, they put you as status 7 for a period of time just to say, okay, he needs to recover from this before they go all the way for transplant. So again, that could be kind of a positive thing, because you know, if you're receiving, for example, an LVAD or something like that, that's just a life-altering, if you will, life-saving technique and a blessing that we have mechanically to assist us so we can wait a little bit longer. And sometimes even an LVAD is referred to as a bridge to transplant. It's just something they do sometimes just to wait things out until you can get that organ. Now, there's another reason why you'll be listed as status 7, and it's not quite as positive. You hadn't gotten better, and they hadn't installed any kind of mechanical devices, but you've gotten sick. You've gotten some sort of virus, some sort of little disease or whatever in the bloodstream or wherever that is, and so they deemed that right now it would be too dangerous to try to transplant this person, and they want to get you past whatever you're dealing with. Sometimes that comes because you're maybe a heart transplant patient and your kidneys start to fail fail. So rather than making a quick judgment that it needs a heart and a kidney, they say, okay, let's just work on these kidneys, try to get them back up and see how we can do, and then we'll put him back up so he can be listed on a active status, maybe a 1 or a 2 status, as we'll break that down in a moment, but we'll put him back up there a little bit later when he gets better. And that's not the best thing, but at least doctors are looking out for you and trying to decide what is best. Now, if you move up from that bottom tier, that status 7, the next thing up on the list is a status 2. Now, status 2 patients are typically those who are listed for transplant. They're actively listed. That is, you can receive a call for transplant, and that does happen, albeit a little bit more rare that a status 2 would receive a call. But you are listed, but you're simply on things like oral medications. And so you don't have any mechanical devices, you don't have any IVs that are permanent implanted in you or anything like that. You're not in any real danger as far as needing life-saving technique and method. However, you still need that transplant, and they're just getting you through right now with medications. Now, in my opinion, if you could be transplanted from a status 2, and you can, but if you could make it to a status 2 to be transplanted, that would be wonderful, because your body is going to be at its healthiest potential, its healthiest point. Obviously, you need a transplant, so you're not doing great, but at the same time, you're going to keep your legs under you. And I've got programs that I've already done about that, how important that is to keep your strength, to keep your other organs in line, and all of that. And a status 2 person typically has that going for him or her, and so they're only on oral medication. So that's status 2. There's a little bit more to that. I'll put a link in the show notes. You can read more about it. But nonetheless, moving up the list, from that point up, you have what's known as a status 1B. Now, status 1B, very simply put, is someone typically who is on 1 or more IVs, and that is maybe they're at home, they could be in the hospital, either one. Probably you're going to be in and out, but you could be at home or the hospital, but you're going to have a permanent, maybe a 24/7 IV running on you, something like milrinone or dibutamine or dopamine, those types of drugs. Anthrothropes, I don't know if that's the right or not, so you don't have to correct me, I'm not sure, but those type of drugs that are life-saving, like milrinone, that cause your heart to squeeze harder and can improve artificially, kind of, but it can improve your ejection fraction, can improve some of your pressures, and buy you time. So you could be listed as a status 1B, be at home or the hospital, and just have some IV medications. Now, you're not going to be a status 2 if you've got an IV, more than likely. You're going to be up to that 1B. That's the second tier from the top. Again, not an awful place to be, because it's possible that you're at home sleeping in your own bed, eating your own food, enjoying your family, but it's not the best place to be, because your health has deteriorated to the point of needing those assistant drugs and such. So that's IV medications at home or the hospital. Now, all the way up to the very top of the list, and this is where the broadest category exists, that is the status 1A. What in the world is a status 1A? Well, that could be anyone from right above where we just talked about, except for now they're going to have multiple different types of IV meds going in, things that have to be managed in the hospital, all the way to someone at the very, very top of that could be on ECMO or some sort of completely artificial mechanical life support system. ECMO is not exactly that, but that's kind of what it is. It bridges you through your kidneys, your lungs, your heart. It can assist all of those organs, even at once if it has to keep you alive so you can get that transplant. So that's where the big span goes. There are so many people now listed as status 1As, some of whom are very, very sick on the ECMO end, others who are just in the hospital and have several different IV lines, as well as those, most of the status 1As. Matter of fact, it's actually one of the criteria listed is that you're going to have what's called a Swan-Ganz. Now, Swan-Ganz is basically, as I term it, like having a 24/7 heart cath going on. Instead of getting into trouble, the doctor's having to rush you in the cath lab, see what's going on, see where your levels have gotten, where your pressures are. They're monitoring those pressures in real time through a Swan-Ganz. Now, the problem with that is you have to be in the hospital to have that, and you're mostly bedridden. Of course, by that time, maybe you're going to be bedridden anyway. You don't have the get up and go that you used to have because it's got up and went. But nonetheless, you're going to have a Swan-Ganz. And those things are not impossible to deal with. It's a good way of keeping those pressures checked so they can make those medication changes on the fly and very quickly and potentially save your life. But it's harder to deal with. So there's a wide spectrum there in that status 1A where people can be extremely sick or not quite as sick, but the majority of them are sicker than everybody else. Now, here's the thing. Status 1As go first. That is, if their hearts have come available, the Status 1As get first dibs, if you will, first picks. And, of course, that's still based on blood type, tissue type, all sorts of other things that you and I wouldn't even comprehend that the doctors know about. But the Status 1As go first. Then the Status 1Bs. That's where the man gets the call from home, and he's got that IV drug, but he gets called in, hey, he's getting a transplant anyway. Then the Status 2s go. And, of course, again, the Status 7s are kind of in a holding pattern. They're not getting the call. But that's not disappointing. That could be a positive thing nonetheless. So that's kind of the breakdown of those. Now, here's where things get a little bit more difficult, especially in the Status 1A category, the top of the list. And that is that even though they're very, very sick people who are not so sick, the majority are all sicker than everybody else, they have what's called exemption status. And what that means is that the doctor has gone to bat and he's filed or she has filed an exemption status for you, which says, okay, we tried this measure, this measure, this measure. It didn't work, or their body won't tolerate it. So we file for an exemption status, again, with UNOS, the United Network for Organ Sharing, and other organizations. They file for exemption status, which says these methods are not working. And so we want them at the top of the list, even though they may not meet certain criteria that are already there. Here's an example. It's my case. Because I was a congenital patient with weird anatomy, I couldn't actually tolerate or even have a Swan Gans installed. So when they brought me in the hospital there, as I gotten too sick to be at home, I'm on an IV medicine or two, that sort of thing's going on already, so I'm a Status 1B. They could not move me to a Status 1A simply by popping the Swan Gans in, which is kind of already a trick up their sleeve, if you will, because I couldn't tolerate it. So they had to file for an exemption status to say, look, we've gone through some other measures, put forth some other efforts, and this is the best we can do. He's not going to survive, and he can't tolerate this or that. I wasn't even a candidate, much of a candidate at least, for an LVAD. Now, they had suggested it, and they were willing to give it a shot, but I wasn't a good candidate for LVAD. And LVAD patients can be Status 1As or Status 1Bs, you know, or even Status 2 if they see fit to drop them for a little bit. But you know, most of the life-saving things that were available, I couldn't tolerate. So the doctors filed for an exemption status and got it, moved me to the top of the list. Now, does that mean that there was not anyone sicker than me? No. As a matter of fact, there were people down the hall from me on ECMO or life support that needed transplants more than I did. And the only reason I may have gotten one before some of them is because maybe they were too sick to tolerate the surgery at the moment, or it wasn't a match, you see. So it's still the potential there that you're at the top of the list, although you may not be at the tippy top, even if you're 1A. And so you might have to look for those exemption status. But that's for judgments between your doctor and the National Organ Donor Associations. That's who decides that. Not me, not you, okay? So that's where the conjecture comes in. That's where you find someone oftentimes who'll say, oh, I didn't have this and I didn't have that, but I was at the top anyway. Well, they either may be mistaken or they got some sort of an exemption. Now, let's draw a line right there. That's the current system. That's the system we've been on for quite a while. I believe it's a fair system. I believe we're doing, and they are doing, I should say, the best they can with that system. But there's a new system around the corner. And when I say around the corner, I don't know if it's a year or two, 10 years out, because it's kind of been trapped up in red tape for quite a while, where they're going to take away those four categories, the 1A, the 1B, the Status 2, and the Status 7, and replace them with a 7-tier system. That is Status 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, there may not quite be 7. There may be a category they skip in there, but basically there's 7, okay? And Status 7 will still be the inactive people, those who are listed, but right now at the moment, it's just not the time to transplant. So they'll still exist. But when you go back up to the very top, the Status 1s, which would have been the Status 1As before, their Status 1s is a much narrower category now. That's reserved for people who are basically on life support, who are on ECMO and other devices like that, who have had more than 30 days of failed VADS devices, who are on multiple IV drugs. They're the sickest of the sick, and so that's why this thing is boiling out like it is. They're going to try to make that top tier just for those people, and then from there you go from not to B, but you drop from 1 to 2. And Status 2 patients, and I'll put this in the show notes below because you really need to read it for yourself, or more of those who they're not on ECMO, they're lying on life support, but again, they've had some of those major life-saving mechanical methods installed, like a VADS, like an impeller, like a heart pump or a balloon pump, and those things are failing. They're not working. The multiple IVs are not working, and so now they're status 2s. The old 1Bs basically are status 2s, and what they're deciding here is that, you know, this patient here needs to be close to the top, but they can't make him, you know, higher than John or Jane down the hall who are on life support. So they're going to divide that up a little bit different. And then there'll be a status 3, which is just a little bit below that. Those will be people with LVADs, that sort of thing, who are having some success. And just read that again. Then status 4, all congenital patients, original congenital patients like I was, will go in as a status 4, which is to say that they're not the sickest of the sick, although we could become that, but their status 4s, because they're congenital, they're going to be difficult. And that's how things are. When you're a congenital patient, their anatomy, or I should say issues with the anatomy, there's some difficulty. So, and then there's status 5, 6, and again 7, the inactive status. Now, that can be hairy. I don't understand it all. I had a doctor back before this list even was made public, I think back in February, prior to February, tell me about it, kind of give me some heads up, give me a paper copy to look at, and I started trying to discern it along with some of his advice. And I'm not saying that what I've said today is perfect, and that's why you need to read it, and really you need to wait this thing out, because we don't know exactly when and if this system will be put into place and how it will affect us. Now, here's the argument, and this is the argument I had when I first heard about this, say back in January of 2017, early in the year, again, prior to it becoming public. The first thing I says, that's not fair. You know, I would have never got a transplant if I had to wait on ECMO. I wouldn't want to have to wait on ECMO. I'd be too sick. I'd probably die. And a lot of people, when they get to that point, they are balancing on a razor's edge of life. So things are hard. It's harder to survive surgeries. It's harder to recover. And I panicked there in looking at that list and thought, you know, the majority of us, the old status 1As, the majority of them won't be 1As anymore. They'll be 2s, and the majority of 2s won't be 2s. They'll be 3s or 4s or inactive altogether. The majority of us wouldn't make it. But let me say this, that's understandable. Of course, I understand it because I said it, but it's also not it's not completely accurate. And that's because still there'll be the case, as it always has been, that the person down the hall on life support was going ahead of me anyway. If they were able to survive the surgery and if there was a potential match, they were going to get the call before I did anyway. Even though we were both listed, or now would have been listed as a 1A, now they're listed as a 1, I'm listed as a 2. They're still going ahead of me either way. So the sickest patients go first, and that's still what the criteria are. What this new allocation system is going to do, or this transplant status listing system for hearts, is going to potentially do is to make the lines more clearly drawn for the doctors. They won't have to file for so many exemption status as they do now to try to put the guys on 1A ahead or behind one another. They can just simply look at the criteria, and it's because it's much narrower, much more specific. They can make a better decision of where to put us, or at least where to file for us to be put, so the Organ Donor Association can make that choice. And I'm so thankful for UNOS, for all these other entities that have come together to create any of these lists. They not only help to seek and to find our organs, but to make those matches for us and to allocate or decide who goes next on the list. And you know, if that was left up to me or you might pick yourself, or you might pick the man down the hall. But nonetheless, they're picking based on real criteria, and that's the better way of doing things. I hope this program has helped you in some way. I understand it's probably been about as clear as an old muddy creek, but that's kind of where we are now. We're at that status level of 4 categories: 1A, 1B, status 2, and status 7. If things change, they change, but it's still going to be, I think, a fair system where they decide that the sickest go first. Some might argue against that, but I think overall the system is fair, and I believe it will remain that way. If this has helped you in any way, please like, subscribe, and share. And I would encourage you now, go ahead below the video and comment. Tell me where you were when you got your transplant, what status you were, if you know that. Explain why you think you were that status or whatever. You don't have to argue. Please don't argue below this or in any of the other social media areas. There's no reason in it. Our wait times are what they are, and there's no one that can predict what that is. We just know the sicker patients go first, and that's all these systems are set to do. But please like, subscribe, and share, and comment below. I'd love to hear from you. But until next time, thank you for watching, and stay stronger, friends.